The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Dusty Creek, casting harsh shadows between the weathered wooden buildings. Margaret Maggie Hartwell adjusted her pale blue cotton dress as she walked toward the jailhouse, a basket of food clutched in her gloved hands. At 23, she possessed the refined bearing her father expected of a sheriff's daughter, but her green eyes held a curiosity that often troubled him. The jail stood at the end of Main Street, like a grim monument to frontier justice. Its adobe walls, reinforced with iron bars, had held countless desperate men over the years. Today, it housed one man whose execution was set for dawn, Diego Morales, the half-Mexican, half-Apache outlaw who'd allegedly murdered Jacob Morrison, son of the town's wealthiest rancher. Sheriff Thomas Hartwell looked up from his desk as his daughter entered, his weathered face creasing into a frown. "Maggie, what brings you here? This ain't no place for a lady, especially with that murderer back there." "I brought food for the prisoner, Papa," she said quietly, setting the basket on his desk. It seemed the Christian thing to do. Thomas's jaw tightened. His steel-gray eyes, the same shade as his thinning hair, flashed with disapproval. "That half-breed don't deserve your charity. He killed a good white boy in cold blood. Every man deserves a decent meal before—" Maggie's voice trailed off. She couldn't bring herself to say "before he dies." "You're too soft-hearted, girl, always have been." Thomas stood, his tall frame casting a shadow across the sun-streaked floor. "But I suppose there's no harm in it. Just don't go talking to him, you hear?" Maggie nodded, though her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the basket. She'd heard the whispers around town, about Diego's mixed blood, about his supposed savagery, about how justice would finally be served. But she'd also heard other whispers, quieter ones from the Mexican quarter, suggesting the condemned man might be innocent. The jail's back corridor was cooler but heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and despair. 3 cells lined the wall, 2 empty, 1 occupied. Diego Morales sat on the narrow cot, his back against the stone wall, dark eyes closed as if in meditation. His black hair hung loose around his shoulders, and despite weeks in captivity, he maintained a dignity that surprised her. "Senor Morales." Maggie's voice was barely above a whisper. Diego's eyes opened slowly. They were deep brown, almost black, with flecks of amber that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. His face, angular and weathered by sun and hardship, showed no surprise at seeing her. "You are the sheriff's daughter," he said, his English accented but clear. "Margaret." "Yes?" "Yes, sir. I brought you some food." She slid the basket through the slot in the cell door. Diego rose gracefully despite his shackles and approached the bars. Up close, Maggie could see the mix of his heritage, the high cheekbones and copper skin of his Apache mother, the refined features inherited from his Mexican father. "That is very kind, señorita. But why do you show mercy to a condemned man?" Maggie met his gaze, searching for the savage killer everyone claimed he was. Instead, she saw only weariness and a deep sadness. "Because mercy should not depend on a man's guilt or innocence, but on our own humanity." A ghost of a smile crossed Diego's lips. "Your father, he would not approve of such talk." "My father is a good man, but—" Maggie hesitated, then spoke her truth. "But sometimes good men can be wrong about other men." Diego studied her face intently. "You doubt my guilt." It wasn't a question, and Maggie found herself unable to lie. "I don't know what to believe. The evidence seemed so convenient." "See, very convenient." Diego reached into his shirt and withdrew a string of wooden beads, worn smooth by countless prayers. "Señorita Margaret, I have one last request. Tomorrow, when the sun rises, I will face my Maker. These belong to my mother. They are Apache prayer beads, but she converted to the Catholic faith when she married my father." He held the beads toward the bars. "Would you take them to Father Miguel at the Mexican church? I would like them blessed before—" His voice caught slightly. "Before I join her in whatever comes next." Maggie stared at the simple wooden beads. Such a small thing, yet the emotion in Diego's voice spoke of deep love and faith. "Of course. I'll see that Father Miguel receives them." "Gracias," Diego whispered, pressing the beads into her palm through the bars. His fingers, calloused from hard work, brushed hers briefly. "You have a kind heart, señorita. Do not let this harsh world change that." As Maggie walked back toward her father's office, the prayer beads felt warm in her palm. Behind her she heard Diego's voice, soft and melodic, speaking what sounded like a prayer in Apache. For the first time since his capture, doubt crept into her heart about the man set to die at sunrise. The Mexican quarter of Dusty Creek lay on the wrong side of the railroad tracks, where adobe houses clustered together like old friends sharing whispered secrets. Maggie had never ventured here alone, but as twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, she found herself walking the dusty path toward the small Catholic church that served the Mexican community. Father Miguel Santos was tending to his modest garden behind the church when she approached. The elderly priest, his white hair gleaming in the fading light, looked up from his tomato plants with surprise. His weathered brown face, lined with years of desert sun and human sorrow, showed gentle confusion at seeing the sheriff's daughter on his doorstep. "Señorita Hartwell, this is unexpected. How may I help you?" Maggie clutched Diego's prayer beads tighter in her palm. "Father Miguel, I come with a request from Diego Morales. He asked me to bring you these." She extended the wooden beads, their surface worn smooth by countless prayers. The priest's eyes widened as he recognized them. "I see. These belong to Maria Morales, Diego's mother. She was a good woman, Apache by birth, but she embraced our Lord with a pure heart." He took the beads reverently. "Diego wishes them blessed before tomorrow?" "Yes, Father." It was his last request. Father Miguel nodded solemnly, then gestured toward the church. "Come, child, let us do this properly." Inside the humble church, candles flickered before a wooden crucifix, casting dancing shadows on the plastered walls. The air smelled of incense and old wood, carrying decades of prayers and hopes. Father Miguel knelt before the altar, the beads cradled in his weathered hands. As he began the blessing in Latin, Maggie found herself studying the prayer beads more closely. Something about them seemed odd. One bead, larger than the others, appeared to have a tiny crack running around its circumference. As Father Miguel's voice rose and fell in sacred cadence, she noticed the crack wasn't natural wear, but seemed almost intentional. "Father," she whispered, interrupting the blessing, "may I examine those beads more closely?" The priest looked puzzled, but handed them to her. Maggie held the larger bead up to the candlelight, and her breath caught. The crack was indeed intentional. The bead was designed to open. With trembling fingers, she twisted it gently. The bead separated into two halves, revealing a tiny hollow space within. Nestled inside was a small roll of paper, yellowed with age. "Dios mío," Father Miguel breathed. "What is this?" Maggie carefully unrolled the paper. The writing was in English, shaky but legible, as if written by someone near death. "If anyone finds this, know the truth. Diego Morales did not kill Jacob Morrison. I saw what happened that night behind the Dusty Rose Saloon. It was young William Morrison who killed his own brother in a drunken rage over a gambling debt. Diego tried to stop the fight, but Jacob was already dying when he arrived. William threatened to kill Diego's sister Rosa if he ever spoke the truth. I was too scared to come forward then, but my conscience won't let me take this secret to my grave." Samuel Fletcher, October 15th, 1883. The paper trembled in Maggie's hands. Samuel Fletcher had been the town's blacksmith, a quiet man who died of consumption just 2 weeks after Diego's arrest. If this letter was genuine, "Father, do you know Samuel Fletcher's handwriting?" she asked urgently. The old priest studied the letter carefully. "See, I knew Samuel well. He came to confession many times in his final weeks, troubled by something he couldn't speak aloud. This is his hand, no doubt." Maggie's mind raced. William Morrison, Jacob's younger brother and heir to the Morrison ranch fortune. Everyone knew he had a drinking problem and a violent temper, but he was white, wealthy, and above suspicion. Meanwhile, Diego, with his mixed heritage and reputation as a drifter, made the perfect scapegoat. "Father, this changes everything. Diego is innocent. But child, will anyone believe this? A letter hidden in prayer beads found the night before his execution?" Father Miguel's voice was heavy with doubt. "And William Morrison, he is powerful, connected. His father owns half the county." Maggie stood abruptly, her green eyes blazing with determination. "Then we'll have to make them believe. This man cannot die for a crime he didn't commit. Your father, he will not be pleased. The whole town expects justice tomorrow. My father is a lawman first. When he sees this evidence..." But even as she spoke the words, Maggie felt doubt creeping in. Her father's prejudices ran deep, and his reputation was tied to this conviction. "Señorita," Father Miguel said gently, "there is something else you should know. Rosa Morales, Diego's sister, she works as a seamstress for the Morrison family. 3 weeks ago she disappeared. Word was she ran off with some traveling merchant, but if William threatened her, she might have fled in fear." Maggie's heart sank. Without Rosa's testimony to support the letter, convincing anyone would be nearly impossible. The church fell silent, except for the guttering of candles. Outside, A coyote howled in the distance, its voice carrying across the desert like a lament for all the injustices the wilderness had witnessed. "What do I do, Father?" Maggie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old priest placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes, child, doing what is right requires great courage. The question is, do you have faith enough to stand against the storm that will surely come?" Maggie clutched the letter and the prayer beads, feeling the weight of a man's life in her hands. Tomorrow at dawn, an innocent man would hang unless she could find the strength to challenge everything her world believed about justice, race, and truth. The candlelight flickered as if responding to her resolve. "Father, help me find Rosa Morales. If she's alive, she's the key to saving Diego and to bringing real justice to Dusty Creek." Dawn was still hours away when Maggie slipped out of her family's house, the wooden floors creaking softly under her careful steps. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with plans and possibilities. Samuel Fletcher's letter was hidden in her coat pocket, along with Diego's prayer beads, but she knew the letter alone wouldn't be enough to stop the execution. She needed Rosa Morales. The pre-dawn air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain clouds. Maggie made her way through the sleeping town toward the Morrison Ranch, which sprawled across thousands of acres north of Dusty Creek. If Rosa had worked there as a seamstress, someone might know where she'd gone, or been taken. The Morrison Ranch house loomed against the purple sky like a fortress of privilege and power. Even in the dim light, Maggie could see the stark contrast between this grand estate and the humble adobe homes of the Mexican Quarter. Here was wealth built on land grants and cattle, defended by prejudice and violence when necessary. Maggie circled around to the servants' quarters, a row of small cabins behind the main house. A thin wisp of smoke rose from one chimney. Someone was awake. She knocked softly on the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. An elderly Mexican woman answered, her grey hair braided and her dark eyes wary. "See? I'm looking for information about Rosa Morales," Maggie whispered urgently. "I'm Margaret Hartwell, the sheriff's daughter, but I'm not here in any official capacity. Rosa's brother is in grave danger and I need to find her." The woman's face hardened. "Rosa is gone. She left weeks ago." "Please," Maggie pressed. "I don't believe she left willingly. Something happened to her, didn't it?" The old woman glanced nervously toward the main house, then stepped outside, pulling a shawl around her shoulders. "I am Consuela. I knew Rosa. She was like a daughter to me. She did not run away with any merchant." "What really happened?" Consuela's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The night before she disappeared, I heard shouting from the main house. Young William was drunk again, screaming at someone. The next morning, Rosa came to me with a bruised face and terror in her eyes. She said she had to leave, that if she stayed, someone would die." Maggie felt ice form in her stomach. "Did she say where she was going?" "North, toward the old line shack up in the canyon. Her grandmother lived there once. It's been abandoned for years, but Rosa knew the place. She said she would hide there until the danger passed." "How do I find this place?" Consuela gave her directions to a remote canyon about 15 miles north, accessible only by a treacherous mountain path. "But, señorita, it is dangerous country. Bandits, wild animals, and worse. No place for a lady alone." "I have to try. A man's life depends on it." As Maggie prepared to leave, Consuela grabbed her arm. "There is something else. The night Rosa fled, I saw William Morrison burning something in the fireplace. Papers, I think. And he was muttering about loose ends and keeping the family name clean." The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture of calculated evil that made Maggie's blood run cold. William hadn't just killed his brother in a drunken rage. He'd systematically covered it up, framing Diego and terrorizing Rosa into silence. By the time the sun crested the eastern mountains, Maggie was riding hard toward the canyon, having borrowed a horse from the livery stable with a hastily written note promising payment. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as she climbed higher, the desert giving way to pine forests and rocky outcroppings. The old line shack sat in a hidden valley, its roof partially collapsed and walls weathered gray by years of neglect. Maggie approached cautiously, calling out in Spanish, "Rosa? Rosa Morales? I'm here to help your brother." A figure emerged from behind the cabin, a young Mexican woman, thin from weeks of poor eating, her long black hair tangled and her clothes torn. But her eyes, so like Diego's, burned with intelligence and suppressed fury. "You are the sheriff's daughter," Rosa said in accented English. "Why do you help us?" "Because your brother is innocent, and I have proof." Maggie dismounted and showed Rosa the letter. Samuel Fletcher saw what really happened. Rosa read the letter, tears streaming down her face. See, this is true. I was there that night. I saw it all. Then why didn't you come forward? Rosa's voice shook with remembered terror. William Morrison. He caught me watching from the alley. After his brother died, he grabbed me, put a knife to my throat. He said if I ever spoke of what I saw, he would kill Diego first, then me, then anyone else in my family. He said no one would believe a Mexican whore over a Morrison anyway. Rosa, you have to come back with me. Your testimony, combined with Samuel's letter— No! Rosa backed away, fear transforming her face. You do not understand. William Morrison, he has men who will do anything for money. If I return, we all die. You, me, Diego, anyone who threatens his secret. Maggie felt desperation clawing at her chest. Time was running out. In a few hours, Diego would face the hangman's noose. But she could see the genuine terror in Rosa's eyes, the trauma of weeks spent hiding in this wilderness, always looking over her shoulder. Rosa, listen to me. My father may be prejudiced, but he's also an honest lawman. If we present the evidence properly— Your father— Rosa laughed bitterly. Your father took money from Morrison to look the other way when his cattle were rustled from Mexican ranchers. You think he will stand against the man who owns half the county? The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. Her father, her upright, moral father, corrupted by Morrison money. But even as she wanted to deny it, pieces of her childhood began falling into place. The new furniture, the expensive dress fabric, the way certain conversations stopped when she entered the room. Even so, Maggie said with fierce determination, I won't let an innocent man hang. Will you come with me or not? Rosa stared at her for a long moment, seeing something in Maggie's face that gave her hope. Finally, she nodded. See, for Diego, I will face whatever comes. As the two women rode hard toward Dusty Creek, the sun climbed higher in the sky. Time was their enemy now, and Maggie knew that even if they reached town in time, the battle for Diego's life was just beginning. The truth was rarely enough to overcome prejudice and power, but it was all they had. The sun hung mercilessly overhead as Maggie and Rosa thundered into Dusty Creek, their horses lathered with sweat and foam. Main Street was packed with townspeople gathered for the execution, men in worn work clothes and women in their Sunday dresses, all eager to witness what they believed would be justice served. A crude gallows had been erected in front of the courthouse, its shadow falling like a dark prophecy across the dusty ground. Maggie's heart nearly stopped when she saw Diego being led from the jail, his hands shackled behind his back. Despite weeks of imprisonment, he walked with dignity, his head held high as the hostile crowd jeered and spat. Sheriff Hartwell walked beside him, his face set in grim determination, while Judge Crawford waited at the gallows with his black book of final words. "Papa!" Maggie called out, dismounting before her horse had fully stopped. "You have to stop this! I have new evidence!" The crowd turned at her shout, surprised to see the sheriff's daughter disheveled and desperate, accompanied by a Mexican woman they didn't recognize. Thomas Hartwell's face darkened with embarrassment and anger. "Maggie, get away from here. This is no place for you, especially not with—" His eyes fixed on Rosa with undisguised contempt. "With her kind." "This is Rosa Morales, Diego's sister," Maggie announced loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "She witnessed Jacob Morrison's murder, and Diego Morales is innocent." A ripple of shocked murmurs ran through the gathering. From the elevated platform where the town's elite had gathered to watch the execution, William Morrison stepped forward. He was a tall, well-dressed man in his late 20s, with pale blue eyes and the soft features of someone who'd never known hardship. His face had gone white at Maggie's words. "Sheriff Hartwell," William called out, his voice carrying false authority, "surely you're not going to delay justice based on the ravings of a desperate woman and the lies of another Mexican." "I have proof." Maggie pulled Samuel Fletcher's letter from her coat. Samuel Fletcher witnessed the real murder. He left a written confession hidden in Diego's prayer beads. Judge Crawford, a heavy-set man with a graying beard, looked intrigued despite himself. "Let me see this alleged evidence." As Maggie handed over the letter, Rosa stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "I was there that night. I saw William Morrison kill his own brother in a drunken rage behind the Dusty Rose Saloon. Jacob owed gambling debts, and William was furious about the family honor. When Diego heard the fighting and came to help, Jacob was already dying." "Lies!" William snarled, but sweat beaded on his forehead. "You'd believe the word of a Mexican whore over a Morrison?" The racial slur hung in the air like a challenge. Several Mexican families in the crowd stirred angrily, while the white townspeople looked uncertain. This wasn't the simple narrative of savage versus civilized they'd been expecting. Judge Crawford finished reading the letter, his face grave. "Sheriff, this appears to be genuine. Samuel Fletcher's handwriting, his seal, and the details match the crime scene in ways that weren't made public." "It's a forgery!" William Morrison stepped down from the platform, his composure cracking. "My father has contributed thousands to this town's development. The Morrison name stands for order and civilization. You're going to take the word of these people over mine." Sheriff Hartwell looked torn, his weathered face a battlefield of conflicting loyalties. His eyes moved from his daughter to William Morrison to the letter in the judge's hands. The weight of Morrison money and influence pressed against the evidence of his own eyes. "Papa," Maggie said quietly, stepping closer to him, "you took an oath to uphold justice. Not Morrison justice, not white justice, just justice." "You don't understand the complexities, girl," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. The Morrison family has been buying your silence for years," Rosa suddenly shouted, her fear finally overwhelmed by rage. "William Morrison threatened to kill me if I spoke the truth. He said no one would believe a Mexican over a Morrison, and he was right, wasn't he? Because this town cares more about money than justice." The crowd erupted in chaos. Some shouted for the execution to proceed, others demanded the evidence be examined, while the Mexican families pressed forward, years of suppressed anger finally finding voice. In the confusion, William Morrison drew a pistol from beneath his coat. "Enough!" he screamed, pointing the weapon at Rosa. "This Mexican bitch has caused enough trouble." But Diego, despite his shackles, threw himself sideways into William's arm. The gun fired wild, the bullet splintering wood from the gallows post. In the struggle that followed, William's desperation and guilt finally overwhelmed his carefully maintained facade. "Yes, I killed him!" William shrieked as men moved to restrain him. "Jacob was weak, a disgrace to the family name. He would have lost everything to gambling debts. I saved the Morrison legacy and I'd do it again." The confession hung in the desert air like thunder after lightning. The crowd fell silent, stunned by the sudden reversal of everything they'd believed. On the gallows, the hangman's rope swayed empty in the hot wind. Judge Crawford's voice cut through the silence with judicial authority. "William Morrison, you are under arrest for the murder of Jacob Morrison and conspiracy to commit murder. Sheriff Hartwell, release Diego Morales immediately." As Thomas Hartwell reluctantly unlocked Diego's shackles, his hands shook with the magnitude of what had nearly happened. An innocent man had been moments from death, and only his daughter's courage had prevented a terrible miscarriage of justice. Diego rubbed his wrists where the iron had chafed, then looked directly at Maggie. "Señorita, you have given me back my life. How does a man repay such a debt?" "By living it well," Maggie replied, tears streaming down her face. "And by forgiving those who doubted you." The crowd began to disperse, many ashamed of their earlier bloodlust, others grumbling about the disruption of their expected entertainment. The Morrison era of influence in Dusty Creek was ending, and a new understanding of justice was beginning, one that wouldn't depend on the color of a man's skin or the depth of his pockets. But as Diego embraced his sister, and Father Miguel appeared to offer prayers of thanksgiving, Maggie knew that changing laws was easier than changing hearts. The real work of building a just community was only beginning. 3 months after the failed execution, Dusty Creek had settled into an uneasy new rhythm. The Morrison Ranch, stripped of William's leadership and tainted by scandal, had been sold to pay debts and legal fees. The new owner, a progressive rancher from California, hired Mexican and Anglo workers equally, paying fair wages regardless of heritage. Maggie stood in the doorway of the town's new schoolhouse, watching as children of different backgrounds sat together at rough wooden desks. Rosa Morales had become the teacher for the Spanish-speaking children, her intelligence finally recognized and valued. The sight would have been impossible just months before. "Señorita Margaret," a familiar voice called behind her. She turned to see Diego approaching, his appearance transformed. Clean-shaven and wearing decent clothes purchased with wages from his new job as foreman at the reformed ranch, he looked like a different man from the condemned prisoner she'd first met, yet his eyes still held that same depth of character she'd recognized in the jail cell. "Diego," she smiled, "you're looking well. How are you adjusting to freedom?" "Each morning I wake expecting to find bars around me," he admitted. "Freedom is a gift I'm still learning to accept." He paused, studying her face. "But you, señorita, you seem troubled. The victory we won, does it not bring you peace?" Maggie sighed, leaning against the schoolhouse doorframe. Victory is complicated. My father, he's been different since that day. The revelations about the Morrison money, about how close he came to executing an innocent man, it's changed him. Indeed, Sheriff Thomas Hartwell had become a more contemplative man. He'd returned every dollar of Morrison money, even when it meant selling personal possessions to make up the difference. His interactions with the Mexican community had grown more respectful, though the change seemed born more of shame than genuine understanding. Change is never easy, Diego said gently. But your father is an honorable man at heart. He will find his way. And what about us? The words escaped before Maggie could stop them, causing heat to rise in her cheeks. Diego's expression grew serious. What about us, señorita? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. In the months since his exoneration, they'd spoken many times about the town's changes, about justice, about the future. But they'd carefully avoided discussing the deeper connection that had formed between them that night in the jail. We come from different worlds, Maggie said quietly. My father's acceptance has limits, and the town, they may have acknowledged your innocence, but that doesn't mean they're ready to accept more. And you, what are you ready to accept? Before Maggie could answer, Rosa emerged from the schoolhouse, her face bright with the satisfaction of meaningful work. Diego, Margaret, perfect timing. I have news from Father Miguel. She led them toward the church where the old priest was tending his ever-present garden. His face lit up as they approached, and he set down his watering can to embrace them. Ah, my children, you arrive at an auspicious moment. I have received a letter from the bishop in San Antonio. He has heard of our story, of how truth prevailed over prejudice, and he wishes to establish a proper school here, one that serves all children regardless of background. That's wonderful news, Maggie said, though her mind remained on Diego's unanswered question. There is more, Father Miguel continued with a sly smile. The bishop has also heard of a certain young woman whose courage in the face of injustice has become legendary. He wishes to offer you a position, Señorita Margaret, helping to establish similar schools throughout Texas. The offer was everything Maggie had dreamed of: meaningful work, the chance to make a real difference, escape from the confines of small-town expectations. Yet as she looked at Diego, she felt torn between opportunity and something deeper. It would mean traveling constantly, she said slowly. Leaving Dusty Creek, leaving those you care about, Diego finished. I understand. That evening, as the desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Maggie walked to the cemetery on the hill overlooking town. Samuel Fletcher's grave was marked with a simple wooden cross, but someone had left wildflowers there, probably Rosa, honoring the man whose final act of conscience had saved her brother. She wasn't surprised when Diego found her there. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the lights flicker on in the houses below. I've been thinking about the bishop's offer, Maggie said finally, and I've been thinking about what you said once, about how mercy shouldn't depend on guilt or innocence, but on our own humanity. Diego nodded. You taught me that lesson, if I remember correctly. Maybe we taught each other. She turned to face him fully. Diego, I want to take the position, but I want you to come with me. His eyebrows rose in surprise. As what? As my partner, in the work, and, she took a breath, in life if you'll have me. Maggie, the challenges we would face, a Mexican man and a white woman traveling together, working together, people won't understand. Then we'll help them understand, the same way we helped Dusty Creek understand that justice isn't about skin color or heritage. She reached for his hand. I learned something watching you face death with dignity. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite the fear. Diego's fingers intertwined with hers, calloused and strong, carrying the memory of hard work and harder survival. Your father will have to accept that his daughter makes her own choices about who to love and how to serve God. As if summoned by their conversation, Sheriff Hartwell appeared at the cemetery gate, his footsteps heavy on the gravel path. He'd aged in the months since the near execution, his grey hair thinner, his shoulders more stooped with the weight of lessons learned too late. Maggie, he said, then nodded stiffly to Diego. Morales, Papa. Thomas looked out over the town, his jurisdiction and his burden. I hear the bishop has made you an offer. Yes, and I'm going to accept it. I figured as much. He was quiet for a long moment. I also hear you plan to travel with company. Maggie lifted her chin defiantly. Diego is a good man, Papa. An honorable man. Surely recent events have proven that. Recent events have proven I'm a poor judge of character, Thomas said heavily. I nearly hanged an innocent man while the real killer walked free. I took money from men who cared more about power than truth." He looked directly at Diego. "I wronged you, son. Wronged you bad." Diego inclined his head. "We all make mistakes, Sheriff. What matters is what we do with the lessons they teach us." "You're a better man than me, that's certain." Thomas turned back to his daughter. "Maggie, you're 23 years old, educated, and braver than anyone has a right to be. If you think this man is worthy of you, then I reckon I better learn to see what you see in him." It wasn't enthusiastic approval, but it was acceptance, a bridge built reluctantly but genuinely across years of prejudice and pain. As the three of them walked back down the hill toward town, the lights of Dusty Creek spread before them like earthbound stars. The community below was imperfect, still struggling with questions of justice and equality, but it was changing. And sometimes, Maggie reflected, change was the most any generation could hope to achieve. Behind them, Samuel Fletcher's grave rested in peaceful darkness, the wildflowers Rosa had left rustling softly in the desert breeze. His final act of conscience had done more than save one man's life. It had planted seeds of justice that would grow long after everyone involved had joined him in the earth. The next morning, as Maggie and Diego prepared to leave Dusty Creek for their new life of service, Father Miguel blessed their partnership with words both sacred and practical. "Go," he said, "and help build a world where a man is judged by his actions, not his ancestry. Where a woman is valued for her mind, not just her obedience. Where justice flows like water in the desert, scarce but precious, and available to all who thirst for it." The desert stretched endlessly before them, full of challenges and possibilities, but they rode into it together, carrying with them the hard-won knowledge that truth, though difficult to establish, was always worth fighting for.